We're pleased to have people here both in person in our annex at the library and on Zoom to another in our autumn series of Invisible Histories talks. As I always say, our talks are free, but we do of course welcome donations, and there's a donate button on our website. Many thanks to those of you who do respond to that call, we appreciate it. We've got two speakers with us today to help us mark Black History Month. We've Shamim Miah from Huddersfield University, co-author of Race, Space and Multiculturalism in Northern England, and Mike Makin-Waite, who has written in his new book On Burnley Road about being a local council officer when the BNP were winning seats in the town hall we worked in. And it's Mike that we're going to hear from first, so over to you, Mike.
Choreography to make myself visible on this. Okay, well, I'd like to start off by thanking my next and colleagues at the Working Class Movement Library for inviting me to speak. I'm really pleased as well to be speaking together with Shamim about these important questions to do with multiculturalism and the way that that is experienced and the way that it plays politically in our towns in North West England and along the M62 corridor into West Yorkshire. As Lynette says, the book which I've recently brought out on Burnley Road is an account of working in Burnley Council through the late 90s and until a few years ago, but with a focus on controversial times. In 2001, Burnley was one of the northern towns which suffered riots and disturbances that summer. And then the following year, Burnley became the first place to see a clutch of British National Party councillors elected. And what the book does is talk about the roots of that dynamic, the explanation that I offer about why those things happen in the town of Burnley, and then tracks a number of different initiatives that were taken in response to that, including the ways that the political parties responded, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems and the Labour Party, along the dominant political organisation in Burnley, but also initiatives at grassroots and community level, including interfaith initiatives and work that I was very much involved in, which was about trying to apply mediation type approaches to the relationships between different sections of the community in Burnley and their representatives and activists from different parts of civil society. And our book's key argument is that what happened in Burnley 20 years ago with controversial developments locally was significant, not only for that town, but in terms of the subsequent dynamic of politics in this country. When we had riots in Burnley in 2001, and when we got fascists elected to the council, we were visited by a great many journalists and researchers and think tank people and government officials. And not all of them, but many of them had a bit of a condescending, sniffy tone as they got off the train or parked up their car in the town hall car park. For a town to have experienced such trouble and such controversy must show that this was a kind of backward place, a weird place where strange things were happening in an isolated northern locale. In fact, although it pains me to say it, Burnley was simply a precursor of trends that became more general. It was a place where it was visible early on, as it was in some other towns, including Oldham and in the areas around Bradford, that working class people were increasingly disconnected from the Labour Party, which had long been the go-to party to represent and advocate for their interests, and were open to the themes that we now recognise as populist nationalism. The BNP expressed those things in very kind of crude, rude, offensive ways, and their momentum declined after a few years. But the same themes, unfortunately, were taken up and promoted in slightly more polite terms by UKIP and Farage's various vehicles. And then recently, of course, they've been incorporated into the way that the government party is running our country. The appeal to far-right populist and nationalist themes was certainly part of what got Johnson and his Tories elected in 2019. And those themes that emerged in Burnley, not in a straight line kind of way, but in a way that effectively metastasized over the years, fed through into politics today. So within that overall account, what I hope I do is incorporate a number of different stories within that. Certainly I tell a lot of anecdotes and accounts of the experiences I had as a local government officer whose responsibilities include working for good race relations in Burnley, and as part of that had the responsibility of working with all councils, including the duly elected British National Party members. As I say, there's other stories about some grassroots initiatives that were taken in the town. But I think what I want to highlight in this talk, which, as Lynette says, forms part of Black History Month, is just some points about the experiences of and the position of the Asian heritage people who live in Burnley, the Black minority ethnic community members who live in the town. And of course, the general understanding about Asian people's position in towns like Burnley and Blackburn and Oldham is that it started in the late 1950s, the early 1960s, as pioneer immigrants came across from the subcontinent. In fact, of course, the relationship between the industry and the economy in towns like Burnley and Blackburn and people of colour across the empire goes back very, very much longer. Because although it's the case that the cotton industry in Burnley was talked about as a local industry, as a traditional thing rooted in the valleys and the hills of East Lancashire, the actual position of the cotton industry in Northern England was that it was one node in a set of relationships with other places and other peoples right around the globe, including in the Indian subcontinent and in Egypt and in the southern states of America. I've worked a lot on the moors of Rotherham, Stall and Burnley and Blackburn. There isn't any cotton that grows there. There's never an ounce of the stuff been made. It was imported through the ports of Liverpool and elsewhere, and of course at one point formed an important component of the slave trade. Fast forwarding through to the 1950s, when it was the case that the British government was encouraging people from British India, recently independent now as India and Pakistan, to move to Lancashire to take part in the cotton industry. They were moving within what was, at least in theory, the same political units. Those were people that were moving in one space as citizens of the United Kingdom and the colonies, and it was only with the racist ordering legislation that was brought in the early 60s that people were pressurised to make choices about whether to stay or whether to return. What subsequently happened?
Speak a bit loud.
Yes. What subsequently happened was that there was a period, in my view, in the 1970s, as the pioneer immigrants began putting down roots, developing their families and establishing their place in the local communities. There was a period in the 1970s when there was a strong possibility of real dynamics towards integration happening. One expression of that was that there was united opposition by the trade union movement and the Labour Party, Communist Party, other left-wing groups, and immigrant workers through their organisations and as individuals to the threat of racism and to the threat of the far right expressed at that time by the National Front. And I remember as a teenager getting involved in demonstrations and marches in East Lancashire that had a real kind of sense of unity to them. What was happening in the 70s as well was that there were big workplaces, both in the cotton industry but in manufacturing and engineering as well, where people were working together, and certainly relationships were building up between workers. All that was disorganised by Thatcherism. It was disorganised in a number of different ways. The attack on large-scale manufacturing industry in East Lancashire meant that those big workplaces where people were meeting and living along with each other and getting to know each other to some degree were closed, and so people, in terms of their working lives, disaggregated into different sectors of the economy. There's a great book actually, which Shamim will know, Verinder Calloway's book about Oldham, from textiles to taxi ranks, which follows that very type of in relation to the community in that town. What also happened was that the racist arguments of the National Front were again in the right form incorporated into the kind of nationalism of Thatcher, and since then I think a number of social dynamics and political dynamics have led to the problem that we have of being divisions within our communities, and that kind of resentment and antipathy was what was being articulated by the BNP in the early 2000s in Burnley, which, as I say, fed through into the dynamics that led then to Brexit and to Johnson's government being elected. That's quite a sketch of the themes that are covered in my book. I hope it gives a sense of them and of the fact that I have sought to incorporate the experience of Asian heritage workers and communities of Burnley and the wider region into the narrative that I give. So it's the simple Shamim Miah to come on. Thanks. Okay.
Thanks very much for that starting point. I am testing the different things with the sound, for those of you who are saying that the sound is not so clear on Zoom. Is that better? Or wave at me if it is. Yes, okay, all right, okay. Hopefully we will be able to carry on with that then. Let us share the screen.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, Mike. I've obviously read Mike's book and had the honour to write a blurb for it at the back, but I've never met Mike before, so it's a nice privilege to meet Mike in person. And just I know because he's two bodies, so he won't be able to actually give you the sales pitch for the book. But it's an excellent book, and I do highly recommend people buying it, not only to support the author, but also I think it's an excellent publisher as well. It's worth supporting. As far as my book is concerned, don't buy it. It's about £70 pounds. Just send me an email, and I'm more than happy to actually give you an electronic version of it. It's capitalist corporation. It's not worth supporting. If you can edit that section and goes up online, I think that would be much appreciated. Anyway, so I'm going to time myself. Sadly, I didn't get the memo that said that my section of the presentation should be about 10 minutes or so. I did the typical academic 40 minutes, but I'm going to try and summarize everything in 20 minutes time. So I'm going to put a timer on it. It will beep. When it does beep, I'm going to stop, because it will be useful to actually get involved in some dialogue and some conversation. And I think that will be much more fruitful than to hear my voice. So here we go. So this short presentation will obviously follow on from where Mike actually kind of left off. And that's basically looking at the questions about identity, looking at the questions about politics, looking at the questions about race in relation to the Muslim communities, Asian communities in the northwest, but also Yorkshire and also Lancashire as well. So that's basically what the presentation aims to do. The thing that I think I find quite fascinating, I mean, in the process of writing a biography of the 14th century Muslim historian and sociologist Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun has this kind of idea of understanding history, not necessarily from the point of view of events, but rather as a historian taking a step back to make sense of history from the point of view of ideas. So in other words, he was interested in the philosophy of history. So what does history signify? What does it mean, etc. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation is to apply more of a Khaldunian approach to this subject matter. Okay, so if I quickly move on, I mean, this is the image of the book. I mean, most of what I'm going to be talking about is taken from one of the chapters. So like I said, the office is still there. If you're interested, just drop me an email. I'm more than happy to actually send you an electronic version of the book. Okay, so let's just start really quickly. If you basically do a Google search, one of the things that you basically find, if you type in Muslims in Lancashire, Muslims in Bradford, Muslims in Oldham or Manchester, etc., these are some of the many images that you basically come up with. That is to say, there is a certain way in which Muslims are actually presented. And that representation of the Muslim community are usually done by images of men with long beards, images of women in niqab or in hijab. So there's a certain way in which our thought processes actually manifest the Muslim other, if you like. What I want to basically do is to give you a rather alternative way of understanding or looking at the Muslim communities throughout the historical period. So one of the things that we don't do when we look at the history of Muslims in Bradford, in Oldham, in Manchester, or even Lancashire, we don't necessarily have the image of Malcolm X. If you look at the previous image, one can basically say it's a very much of a conservative, very much of a right, from the political right, kind of, orthodox way of looking at, Muslim community or Muslim identities. The things that we don't necessarily do is look at Muslim communities from the point of view of the left. So this is obviously an image of Malcolm X when he basically came to Manchester in 4th of December 1964, a few months before he was basically assassinated. And basically one of the things that you have in the image behind him is the first person you basically have that basically is introducing him, this gentleman here with the glasses, is a treasurer of Forces. Forces is the Federation of Islamic Societies of Islamic Federation of Society of Islamic Societies. He was a treasurer. Then you have Shamim Miah. Shamim Miah used to be a professor of physics at Manchester University until recently. And you also have the person on the far left. He was a very active person within a Stop the War coalition just recently. So one of the things that we can have is a rereading of Muslim history in Britain. That basically challenges the kind of the orthodox view, the conservative view of Muslim communities. And what we can do is basically say that the history of Malcolm X, the history of Islam and Muslim communities has been reimagined. And these are some of the many literatures that have come out in the past, say, for example, 10 years or so. This book in particular by Hamid Dabashi, the one on the right there, has a Islamic liberation theology, rereading of textual history of the text from the point of view of equality, justice, and fairness. And one of the key characters that he basically uses as a way of reconceptualizing Muslim theology is Malcolm X, his writings, but also his speeches as well. So that's to basically say that there is a direct relationship between the Muslim community living in the diaspora and the writings of Malcolm. And if you like, when Malcolm X came to England back in the 1960s, there's two recent books that's been published. One by Saladin Amber by Oxford University Press, and the other one by Stephen Tuck. Both of them basically talk about Malcolm X's time in London. They don't actually touch of any of his interactions with the Islamic organizations in Manchester, in Birmingham, or London. But so there is a rereading, going back to the materials and basically trying to make sense of Malcolm X within these Islamic ideas. And this is the point that Zaid Sharkey basically makes in a conversation that he had with Malcolm X's wife, Betty Shabazz. And she basically said, look, the socialists have basically championed Malcolm X. The Black Liberation Movement has basically championed Malcolm X. But one of the things that the communities not necessarily done is to champion Malcolm X's Islamic kind of identity, or his Muslim identity, if you like. So it's within that spirit that you basically get most of the literature that actually kind of comes through. Okay, so where does that? What does Malcolm X's heritage mean in relation to Muslims in Britain or Muslim communities in Bradford? So if you take this book by Rama Murphy, it basically focuses on the Britain's Asian youth movement. Britain's Asian youth movement is basically very much a left-wing organisation connected with the Communist Party, and basically not only that, it connects with various other kind of liberation movements throughout Britain. So one can basically argue is that through the writings of the Asian youth movement, you can basically have that kind of lineage that connects Malcolm X's ideas with the Asian youth movement as well. The other thing that you basically can also have is, well, if you look at popular culture, we look at popular culture in particular, this particular group that basically started off in Bradford, called Fundamental. You can also find that the Malcolm X's inspiration actually runs through this particular organisation. And in particular, I mean, this is a quote from Swedenborg. It's one of the key kind of texts on Islam and popular culture. He basically says that Fundamental promotes militant anti-racism, community self-defense, pride in Islam, racial consciousness, anti-imperial sentiments, connection between Black and Asian struggles and the teachings of the Nation of Islam, mixed with strong dose of punk provocation. So it's a really interesting way in charting that kind of struggle, charting that kind of history, if you like. And these are some of the many quotes from Rama Murthy's book that once again has this relationship between blackness as a political identity, and not necessarily blackness as skin pigmentation, but rather blackness as a political struggle that basically connects anti-colonial oppression to what's basically happening in the Irish kind of struggle, if you like, but also with the miners' strike that's basically happening as well. So it's all connecting that kind of working class kind of a consciousness with the Black struggle, but also with the political movements in different parts of the world, from Latin America to Africa, etc. And the thing that the Asian youth movement basically did was to use, and this is here once again quite interesting in the way in which they're defining themselves, they're defining their self-identity through the idea of blackness. So here once again, blackness is a political category, not necessarily a racial kind of category, if you like. And within that experience, you basically have a number of periodicals that basically that actually came out called the Kala Dala with the Black Star, the Mountain of the Black Worker, but also this idea of kind of Black consciousness, if you like. And if you do a quick Google search, you will basically find that the United Youth League of Bradford, and this is obviously the Champion of the Black kind of 12 kind of incident that basically happened in Bradford back in the early 80s. If you look at the what's the word that I'm looking for now? The actual political material, if you like. If you look at the banner, it's here. It's quite visible in terms of United Black Youth. They don't necessarily define themselves as Asians, not necessarily saying they're Muslims, but they're very much kind of linking with that kind of political struggle, if you like. And here, this is the point that I make to my students as well, is that if you look at throughout history, you basically find I mean, if you take the book, you know, how the Irish became white, or say, for example, how Jews became white folks. I mean, this is a kind of classical text within, you know, within the history books, in which that the definition of whiteness, even for the white working class, if you like, the definition of whiteness isn't necessarily given as an ontological reality, but rather it basically gets constructed throughout history, if you like. And this is something that we basically forget when we talk about the white working class. The white working class becomes white working class at a particular moment in history. You know, the Muslim communities in Britain becomes Muslim at a certain moment in, you know, in history, if you like, in terms of, you know, self-definition, but also how people actually define the Muslim community as well. Now, I'm not necessarily labor on the point about the Bradford 12, but there's a really interesting way looking at how kind of class solidarity kind of was the key essence of the political campaigning that basically went towards the Bradford 12. And here are some of the many groups that basically was part of that kind of, you know, the July 11 action committee. And this is unfortunate, this is part of a history that we don't necessarily kind of look at. We just kind of, you have to dig into the history books to actually find, you know, this out. But the thing happens here, once again, mindful of the time, that's why I'm putting things in short, is the Scarman report following the Brixton riots. And if you like, back in the 1980s, the early part, the mid part of the 1980s, you basically find that this way of looking at Muslim identity from the point of view of a combination of factors, whether it be, you know, class, to do with blackness, to do with the political struggle, etc., starts to get faded out. And the reason why that gets actually faded out is what Ramamurthy basically talks about, how the councils in particular, and that's why it would be useful to actually get Mike's thought on that, councils started to actually form independent groups through their kind of ethnic markers. So you have the rise of, I don't know, the Older Bangladeshi Youth Association, you have, you know, the Bradford Council of Mosques, and these were kind of encouraged by the local authorities, but also were widely kind of funded, supported through, you know, funded as well. That basically nurtured this idea of independent kind of a silo kind of identity, moving away from this idea of broad kind of class-based struggle, if you like. But there was that, but also there was various other events that was taking place as well. The Rushdie affair was a single key moment that basically led to the rise of Muslim identity. In the same way that you had a separate Sikh identities basically developed after the Operation Blue Star, and the tensions between kind of Sikhs and Hindus can also be, you know, traced back to the late 1980s. But if you look at the Asian youth movement, I mean, you had Sikhs, you had Muslims, you had the Hindus, all part of one particular organization. The thing that basically mattered was their class, you know, the class consciousness, if you like. So I just find it interesting to kind of redefine, to re-look at the way in which our identities, if you take that broader kind of historical viewpoint, if you like, and how that kind of evolves, and what Stuart Hall talks about, the idea of identity as a process of becoming. It's not necessarily a fixed destination, if you like. Okay, I'm going to quickly move through that because obviously, you know, time is of the essence, and I want to be, you know, give more time to Mike to respond to some of the questions. But also, I mean, here this is a useful book by Aaron kind of Kondinani, the Muslims are coming by, published by Verso Press, and here, you know, you basically find that things start to change as well. You know, this idea of looking at, you know, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, etc. You do have a broader kind of anti-colonial kind of sentiments creeping back in to the way in which Muslim identities are conceptualized or reconceptualized at this point, if you like. I mean, if you look at Muslim identities at this particular moment, especially with the work that's basically happening with, you know, Salman Yaqub and various other people with that kind of a solidarity between various kind of anti-colonial kind of struggles, anti-war movement, the CND, etc. you basically find an interesting reconceptualization of identities that's basically taking place. But equally speaking as well, you also have this return to blackness, this return to the sentiments of Malcolm X, this return to this idea of let's look at other people's oppressions, let's work from, learn from that, but also let's be quite strategic in the way in which we basically respond to political struggles. And I just leave a couple of points. I mean, this is an interesting documentary called The New Muslim Couple. And that basically looks at how within the popular culture, in the same way that we basically looked at fundamental and the way in which identities is being reconceptualized through popular culture. This is a really interesting documentary that basically ties together the idea of the works of Malcolm X, popular culture, hip hop music, and how all that kind of fuses together with a strong political reaction to the securitization agenda in the States. I'll just leave this here. I've got 2 minutes and 54 seconds, so I'm doing relatively well. And this is a really interesting book, and it's looking at rebel music. It's basically looking at Muslim popular kind of subculture, and especially the way in which identities are defined or redefined at this moment, but also the way in which music is basically used as a way of making political statements. And here, Shamim Miah says, Muslims in the last decade have discovered, I would argue rediscovered race as a political tool, and the ghetto as a site of struggle. Black internationalism increasingly provides an archive for which young Muslims in Europe and also the US can draw upon and reinvigorate Islamic thought. Thus, what is striking about the last decade is not the emergence of Islam as a new post-war left, but youth disaffections with the current Islamic movements and the attempts to build an Islamic left by revisiting the Bandung era, mining historical interactions between the Black Atlantic, Islam and anti-colonial struggles. So I think I've done really well to summarize the 40 minutes presentation. And I do apologize if I've actually gone really, really fast, but I've got 1 minute and 39 seconds left for my 20 minutes. So thank you very much.
I'd like to just stop sharing the screen, and Mark, if you want to come and I'll check that you're both visible. I'll zoom.
Sorry, how do I stop? Stop share.
Stop share, yeah. To do it.
I don't want to press the button that basically wipes everybody.
Right, I can.
So,
if you go a bit, yeah, that is working okay. Right, thank you. Over to the both of you.
Okay, yeah. So can I ask Mike a question if that's okay?
Of course.
Yeah. So I guess my first question is I talked about briefly in my presentation how Muslim communities are being essentialized as the other. I get the same feeling that the white working class are also being essentialized and demonized as the other as well. Owen Jones and various other people have kind of talked about that. And I'm thinking of not Sivanand, I forget the chap from, he'll name will come to me actually. This idea of the working class being the site of racism, but also equally speaking, the sites of anti-racism as well. So I'm just wondering, because the BNP were defeated in Burnley, if you just kind of just share with us, some of the broader kind of political struggles, but also how different organizations were actually involved in defeating the BNP. I know it's quite.
Several questions.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
The first thing to say is I think the thing that was very valuable about the point that you were really focused on in your presentation there was the problem of communities being essentialized, of people defining communities as if they are one thing and as if they can be put into a particular box. And that was something that was a problem. You hinted at that in terms of the way that local councils related to Asian heritage people, Muslim communities in our towns back through the 1960s, 70s into the 80s. I remember in Burnley in the 1990s, there was one moment before the very controversial days in local politics when there was a little bit of a scandal about the ways in which some groups in the Asian community were being funded by the local council, receiving different grants, but that some of the same individuals were in different organisations that were receiving grants. And this was assumed by some people to be evidence of fraud. It wasn't. There was nobody actually enriching themselves. But of course, I can at the same time be a member of a particular religious organisation and have a separate but overlapping set of cultural interests. So why not be in two organisations which are legitimately seeking grants from the council? Now, this led to quite a bit of a debate. And I remember, although I wasn't directly involved in working on these issues at that time, having a bit of an argument with a colleague who said, well, you know, why aren't they all pulling together? Why aren't they all organised as one group? We would never have asked such a thing of the residents of a white area of town. We understand that they have different community organisations, different religious churches, that they'll vote different ways at local elections. So that kind of simplistic way of local authorities and other official bodies wanting to relate to communities through community leaders or very simplistic one-dimensional channels, I think, was part of what then people reacted against in a way that led perhaps to some fragmentation. You said about how the white working class, and I always put that phrase in inverted commas, has been vilified and stereotyped as well. And I think that's true. But a curious thing about it is the white working class, so-called, has also been celebrated and used by political forces. It's the case that some racist independent councillors in Burnley in the 1990s, and then the BNP, and then I would say the people who've been promoting antipathy to immigration and antipathy to Europe have appealed to a notion of the white working class, which is in favour of the Union Jack, opposed to immigration, opposed to Europe, wants its legitimate concerns to be addressed, and it's positioned the white working class, so-called, as separate to all the other members of the working class, who of course are diverse and multiracial and multicultural in their identity. And this is a divisive politics which is misusing the term working class and hooking it to a racial signifier for reactionary purposes. Of course, there are people who are white and working class, and of course some of them voted BNP or Brexit or whatever. But to think that there is an essential identity which characterises all white people who are working class and which explains what their views are is not the case. Sorry, that answers some of your questions.
No, it certainly does, yeah. Thank you.
Shall we?
It's wondering if it's useful to actually just open it up, because I'm just quite conscious of people here. And
there's things in the chat as well.
There is a specific question in the chat, which is about gender.
Yeah.
Helen says, no reference, let alone analysis of gender, almost without exception, all the images were of men. So I think that's probably over to you, Shamim.
Yeah,
I'm sure you did, as you said, you galloped through, and I'm sure there was many more. It's probably a 10 lecture series rather than a 20-minute talk. If you'd like to respond to that.
No, thank you very much, Helen. I think that's a really valid question. I think the way in which we present history is often actually from the point of view of men, and if that's the impression that I've given, I do apologise. So if we look at the case of the Asian youth movement wasn't necessarily a predominantly male kind of organisation. We had a number of female activists also kind of involved as well, but the timescale didn't necessarily allow me to actually kind of delve into this in greater detail. The person that's basically done the bulk of the historical archival analysis is Ram Murthy, and obviously she's done a very diligent a job also as a historian, but also as as an activist as well. So there's obviously some acknowledgement that needs to be made there as well. I mean, I think what we could have, leaving aside Salma Yaqub's kind of politics, if you like. I mean, I think that is a classical example of how the merging together of Islamic activists who are disenfranchised by the various Islamic movements, if you like, and how that kind of shift away from the Islamic, the traditional way of doing politics through the Islamic organization, how that kind of shift happens more towards a kind of working in solidarity with various kind of organizations, mainly left-wing organizations, etc. I mean, obviously, if we had more time, we could have done an entire lecture on that as well. So, I mean, the history of women's struggle needs to be kind of factored in. But I mean, it's to do with the time scale that I had to kind of do a number of kind of leapfrogs, if you like, throughout history. I mean, that's the problem that we basically get if you apply the Chaldean kind of understanding of history. When you're looking at not necessarily events within the past 10 years or 5 years, when you're trying to take 50 years and try and make sense of history through that kind of lens, if you like. There's obviously ways in which we kind of include certain narratives and we kind of keep out certain narratives. But so that certainly wasn't my intention. So I hope that answers the question. And
Sure. Matt, have you got anything you'd like to add, Matt?
Well, just briefly, it's quite right that this question's raised, and it's the case that the position of women and the role of women in, for example, Muslim communities, Asian heritage communities, a kind of simplistic observations and judgments about that position has been one of the ways in which the community has been stereotyped, but lived reality shows you that that stereotype doesn't stick. If you look even at small towns like Burnley and Oldham, over recent years you've seen women, Asian women, Muslim women taking an increasing number of varied and prominent roles in local society, including local politics. Leader of Oldham Council, now Asian Heritage woman. There's women councillors on Burnley Council from the Muslim community. Included from the Batam community, which is supposedly traditionally seen as much more conservative. So you should simply test any of these myths and representations about the way that the community is presented, including in respect of gendered relations, to simple observation. Things are always more complex, more messy, more interesting than the way that simplistic discourse tries to position people in particular ways.
In the hall we have Steve. Steve, can you shout loudly or come a bit nearer so people on Zoom can hear you?
Thanks for the presentation, Mike and Shamim. Following Mike's last comment, it's good that women have got positions of power now politically, because back in the 80s in Burnley, or the 90s, I'm sure about older, but a lot of those funded organisations were used by certain men to create power bases for themselves. They also, though, welcomed women-only organisations for cultural reasons, and those could have been a base for political action, but were they at any stage, I don't recall in my time in Burnley, as women's groups, where got any political power. Could they have been used more or supported more to become more grassroots politically?
Could I just respond to that?
Can you possibly summarise the question just in case people on Zoom haven't heard it?
Okay, so it's a question about Steve Roman's talking from his experience. We were colleagues working in local government in different wings of local authority provision back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And Steve's recalling that the way that funding worked was that many of the organisations in the Black minority ethnic community that did receive local council funding were male dominated. There were some almost tokenistic forms of support for women's groups, and was that a missed opportunity? I think is the gist of what you were putting forward. I think my observation, having worked in Burnley from from 96 through until 3 years ago, is that there were a number of extremely remarkable women who decided how to play the situation that they were in very impressive and well thought through ways, by doing a lot of work almost under the radar to establish a positive provision for their own space to say how they saw things and to influence other people, and to bit by bit build alliances and create opportunities which are now coming to fruition. There's all kinds of tactical judgments and deciding when to play things that are part of anybody's activity as a community activist or somebody involved in local politics or somebody involved in campaigning work. There's a heck of a lot more pressures on women from that community in terms of what they feel they can choose to do so as to make steps forward which will be possible to maintain and keep momentum going on the basis of them. I think that's what was shaping the way that they decided to handle things. I'm conscious of talking, if you like, about people who I can't speak for, but those views are based on deep conversations with a number of women from Burnley over the years.
Helen, who asked the original question, points out that I summarised her question and it was a lot longer than that. Helen, would you like to unmute yourself and do yourself justice?
Well, hi, thanks for that. I mean, I appreciate time is short. I suppose what I was questioning, and I agree completely with you about stereotypical representation, is that surely at every opportunity we should counter that representation. And I appreciate, you know, in your talk, suddenly what you thought was going to be 40 minutes was like that. So I suppose that was just a plea, let's find more coverage that reflects the situation. For example, you know, if you think of the whole raft of women who were involved in the anti-war movement, particularly, you know, and the various movements against the war, the invasion of Iraq and all that sort of thing. I do, just following on from the last question about the role of women's groups and whether there was a certain amount of, I hesitate to use a harsh word like manipulation behind the scenes, but coming from a background of working in the not-for-profit sector in Burnley and in Oldham, I did have some experience of this. And I think, and I certainly hope now that local councils appreciate that a great deal more of complex work is needed to truly reach a whole raft of people that are in need of support for all the great ideas they've got. And I'm sure that some of that will start to be happening as the diversity of representation on councils increases. So just a couple of comments, really. Thanks for the chance to come in on that.
Any follow-up from either of our speakers?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I think that's a really valid point. I mean, I don't know where to start to report to, because I mean, there's been so much happening within the past 20 years or 30 years, if you like. I mean, there's a whole movement of Muslim feminist writers, you know, from the States, from France, from Morocco, you know, from the UK, etc. That doesn't necessarily get recognised. So there's that kind of textual rereading, you know, from challenging kind of patriarchal norms is basically, you know, a key thing that, you know, I could have spent a whole hour, you know, discussing that from the, you know, writings of Rana Kabani and Fatima Merwanesi and various kind of feminists, if you like. But also there's been a more kind of a politically astute kind of feminists who basically not only challenge kind of patriarchal norms, but also kind of question the way in which women has been used as political tools, if you like. So, for example, if you look at Afghanistan or Iraq, the justifications on that was basically, you know, saving brown women from brown men, so to speak. So the way in which we have a kind of military struggle played out, you know, just kind of on the grounds of gender equality. I mean, that's most of the critique of that basically is come from kind of feminist writers and feminist intellectuals. But unfortunately, you know, that doesn't actually get fed into the kind of mainstream discourse. But yet still we kind of have this idea of, you know, Muslim women who are kind of passive, you know, they don't necessarily have a voice. I mean that image is there. It needs to be. I mean, I'm not saying that the Muslim community doesn't necessarily have any issues with patriarchy, but the picture is more complex, you know, from the point of view of look at the number of Muslim girls that basically get in GCSE A-level results. Look at the sheer number of Muslim women in the parliament that outnumbers, you know, the Muslim men. And if you look at the seats, I mean, if you look at the seats that they can, if you look at the seats that they're basically from, they're not necessarily from white majority communities. They're actually from mainstream kind of communities, Muslim communities like the Bradford, etc. You know, Birmingham, Bolton, London. So you know, I think that the picture is much more kind of complicated, and I think it's, I mean, like anything else, it's much more, you know, much more nuanced. And I think someone's already pointed out there about the Southall kind of Black Sisters, and you know, the Respect Party. The Respect Party was obviously championed by, you know, so many, etc. So you know, there's this. I mean, there might be an entire new lecture there, you know, for that. But you know, I thank Helen for, you know, raising the point. I think it's really, you know, really important. Thank you.
Thanks. And we've got to, I'll take one from here and then come to you, from Julian on Zoom. Are the narratives and or intellectuals creating a sense of class solidarity behind the current divides, beyond the current divides? What are your thoughts about multi-faith narratives and intellectual work going on now? Sorry, Janet, that's Janet. Yeah.
So yeah, Shamim, thank you for emphasising the intellectual work, because I was reflecting with David Mottram earlier, actually, that in the past, people in the British left would have looked internationally, for example, to somebody like Malcolm X, to inspire and inform thinking about working class movements, and something shifted so that the possibility of the left in Britain being informed by, rather than simply compassionate towards, or culturally engaged by the pop culture, you know, that the possibility of an intellectual engagement led by, for example, a Muslim left, or for example, by multi-faith progressive conversations against patriarchal forces in religion, that seems to have disappeared from the left, really, in the UK. And so I was just looking for some suggestions, really, about if we were looking for somebody who could influence our thinking today about these matters, whether it be, but yeah, in particular, from outside of the so-called mainstream, or yeah.
No, thank you. Hi, Janet. Janet taught me history, so.
Janet, I think I recognise you as having taught me youth and community studies as well. Am I right?
Yes,
Maybe.
I
Clearly am.
Janet is the reason we're all here today. Thank you very much, Janet.
Absolutely, and completely not the case. Please, let's distract from that, and let's have.
Well, let me just say that whoever it was who taught me youth and community studies when I was training to be a youth worker said to me, when you're doing your practice, you need to record things that you find interesting. And it's the fact that I took that advice, that I had books and notebooks that enabled me to, when I got made redundant from Burnley Council, go back to them and start putting together that. So anyway, shall we answer the question?
Yeah, Jan, no, that's a fantastic question. I mean, just off the top of my head, I mean, I'm more than happy to actually give you more references. If you look at historically, I mean, look at the figure of Edward Said. I mean, Edward Said's key influences was like Ejaz Ahmed and various people like that from, you know, these are Pakistani kind of intellectuals from Pakistan. But also there's a whole book that's been written on it by Priyanda Gopal called The Insurgent Empire. And that basically tracks, it's more of a historical book. And it basically raises the questions about the left, not necessarily always giving something to the, say for example,
Yeah, exactly.
In India and Africa, but rather the left actually drawing from the inspirations, drawing from a number of kind of ideas, if you like. So I mean, that book's a really fascinating book. It's full of references, and I mean that's a really important book because it raises the question about kind of epistemological questions about the role of, you know, the black struggles within UK, but also within the diaspora as well. But also, I mean, thinking about someone like W.E.B. Du Bois and various other people like that. I mean, who's got, you know, fantastic kind of ways in which you know, the way in which we look at sociology, the way in which, you know, the way in which we kind of do sociology as well. And I think Ibn Khaldun is, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of spending a lot of time writing this biography really, because I do think that he has an interesting way in which we should look at history, read history, but also, I mean, he was seen as the precursor to the modern, you know, sociology. I mean, Auguste Comte, who's seen as the father of sociology, had access to his 3-volume Muqaddimah. Arnold Toynbee as well. I mean, he was very much inspired by, you know, Ibn Khaldun. I'm thinking about various other individuals, about Al-Biruni. I mean, nobody hardly mentions Al-Biruni's writings, but I mean, he was a profound intellectual kind of thinker, especially within the field of kind of ethnography. So there's quite a number of, you know, thinkers there that can, you know, help help us with some of the big questions, you know, of the day.
Just really briefly, the one place where I am aware of real effort being made to bring different progressive traditions into dialogue with each other, not just in relation to politics, but in relation to cultural work, is around a journal brought out by Lawrence and Wishaw, which is Soundings. That is making a strong effort at the moment to connect with younger intellectuals from different traditions, from different identities, and there's some articles in recent copies of that which very directly address the kind of questions that Janet's raised there, in my view.
I have to say that I'm going to be running this recording again because there's so many books that I think we don't have in the library that we ought to be getting. So I will be certainly taking this on board.
Hit those donate buttons.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mike. Yes. Hit donate now. Enable us to buy the books. Yeah, good marketing. A question from the floor here. Thanks.
Yeah. How do I word it? Basically, the Black Lives Matter movement as a sort of ideology, is a sort of current way of seeing these constructs. How do you see it? Like this sort of, I would sort of link it in with this call out culture and people taking their, almost like putting a responsibility on each individual rather than looking at everything as being this institution, this establishment. How do you think that affects this idea of, like you say, you have the Muslim community, like how do you think, like I personally like mixed race, like Asian and white, and it's brought up a lot of stuff for me personally, which is a positive thing, but it's also been, for me personally, a way of like me starting to almost divide myself more in a way, which I sort of see as a positive thing, but it's weird because like my whole ethos is always like this divide and rule thing is really like a negative thing for like the struggle. But how do you sort of see it? Like how do you see it with these issues?
Okay. One of the things I've found as I've been doing community work in different parts of the North West and West Yorkshire over the last few years is that the Black Lives Matter movement has really generated very positive discussion on these issues. And one of the reasons for the positivity is that the most of the expressions of that commitment to Black Lives Matter just show that this is an issue for all of us. This isn't an issue about Black people speaking against the oppression that they themselves are experiencing or fear. It is something which we're talking about as something which we've all got an interest in. And when I've been debating it and talking about it in community centres and workplaces in towns from Leeds to Liverpool, those are the framework for it. It's very much a movement which I think has promised the possibility of moving beyond disabling sectionalism and saying we would all benefit if we lived in a society where Black people were not facing oppression and racism. Now, for me, there's no contradiction between that drive for saying we have to have a shared agenda that cuts across the specific distinct identities that we have, and at the same time, people being proud of who they are, celebrating who they are, being their own distinctive people and characters, given the particular combinations of family history and cultural identity and affiliations. The challenge is to bring these two into a kind of productive relationship rather than allowing divisive forces to say we need to be separate because I'm this and you're that and you're from there and I'm from here. I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. But it's weird the way I'm saying device. Like for me, I've just sort of awoken to actually a lot of discrimination I was facing that I didn't realise was actually race related, but I kind of see it now. So it saved me from, it's kind of taken me out of that situation and sort of woken me to certain things. So it's almost like it's made me more solid with the whole struggle in a way, but just awoken me to certain power situations that I was ignoring, if that makes sense, like, or I was trying to, even though I've been brought up class conscious, I was sort of trying to overlook, which I won't now.
No, and of course it can be an unsettling and negative experience to kind of recognise that there are hurts and oppressions that have been going on which we've not seen before. But it's only when we can see the challenges that we face that we can begin to work with others to tackle them. So I'm hopeful that is going to be an ongoing result of BLM.
No, I think that's really, I think what the BLM movement's actually done is it's got various other communities to think about the way in which they look at the world. So for example, within my own world as a young Muslim, young, no longer young, it's allowed me to actually rethink my own history. So for example, if you look at the history of Islam, it begins with the Middle East. It starts off with the Umayyads, the Abbasids, then it goes to India, etc. And then it ends with the Ottoman Empire. But then you ask yourself, well, what if we actually looked at Islamic history from the point of view of West Africa? Instead of starting off in the Middle East, what if we started in West Africa? How does our understanding of Islam actually look from that kind of vantage point? We started off with Mali, we started at Timbuktu. So I think that is really crucial. You allowing the Black Lives Matter movement to actually obviously to understand what's happening about kind of the struggles about race and kind of the systemic problem of racism in societies, but also trying to ask the question about, okay, so how can we apply that to kind of look at our own history, from bottom up, so to speak. So that's the first point about having the Black Lives Matter, using that as an introspective tool, as a way of questioning some of the kind of dominant ways in which we basically look at history. The other thing that I also think about the Black Lives Matter, if you look at some of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, is the point about intersectionality, about looking at race. I mean, I said this to my daughter. I mean, she's just started university, doing sociology. I lost my son because he did mathematics, followed the footsteps of my wife. Anyway, so I've at least got someone doing sociology. And I said to her, look, when you start to do sociology, the thing to look at is look at it from the point of view of intersectionality. As an Asian, female, Muslim, so it's not just necessarily the race, it's the gender, it's your race, it's to do with your social class, and you can add disability on top of that. You can add, your sexuality on top of that as well. So I think that's really crucial, is to say that, look, how people experience discrimination can be multifaceted, and it's the case of identifying, acknowledging some of the complexities that's actually kind of involved. I mean, it really got me thinking about, especially with the recent debate about, Sarah Everard and, looking at sexism, but also looking at patriarchy and what have you. So I think it's really crucial for us to kind of look at, those elements of intersectionality, but also solidarity as well. I mean, my own upbringing has allowed me to actually understand how minority communities or minoritized communities, whether it be from the point of view of gender, sexuality, various other political struggles, because of my own experience, I'm able to actually put myself in their shoes. I mean, so that's also crucial as well. So it's not necessarily just trying to push your own agenda, but trying to work in solidarity with various other communities so that we can actually address the other struggles of oppression as well.
Sounds like a good positive note to end on. The struggles continue. We have lots of stories of struggle in the library, although, as we've said, there are more that we can be getting in there, and the idea of linking history to the present is something that the library is absolutely passionate about. So we hope that all of you, both here in the annex and on Zoom, have found something to work on as a result of today, and we look forward to you coming to the library if you're able to help as part of that search of yours. So thank you very much indeed to both of our speakers here today. We have appreciated you being here, and this talk has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and there'll be a link on the event webpage. Next week we'll be back in our usual Wednesday 2 p.m. slot. So on Wednesday, the 3rd of November, 2 p.m, we'll be welcoming Oliver Price, whose topic is Militant Tendency and the Surveillance of Trotskyists in Cold War Britain. And you'll be able to attend that in person or on Zoom. Till then, best wishes to you all, in solidarity from all at the Working Class Movement Library. And I'll move over to the other screen to press stop to say goodbye.